Hey everyone, this is John Puritz. Welcome to the Man Up Already podcast. This show is dedicated to each of us being better in all areas of our lives, mentally, spiritually, physically, and relationally. We want to help you be a better you because when you man up already, the world around you is greatly impacted. Here on the podcast, we don't believe you're an accident. We believe each of us is created for purpose, and this show is dedicated to helping you discover and live out that purpose. Again, welcome to the show, and let's check out another great episode. All right, everyone. Hey, welcome to the Man Up Already podcast. Super excited to have you here. And man, what a great year we have going here already. The guests that we have lined up, the guests that we've had, every episode continues to just get better and better here, and I'm super pumped for it. So before we bring up our amazing guest today, I want to remind everybody, hey, go out to manupalready.com, and there you will find not only the Man Up Already book, which I highly recommend because that's just where all this stuff comes from, but the 2024 Man Up Already Growth Conference is live for purchase. To get tickets for that event, it's February 24th on a Saturday from 9 to 2 in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Tickets are $25, and they can be found at manupalready.com. And we're limiting it to 50 men. So the event is called A Few Good Men because really, truly, it is only open to a few men that we're going to pour into that day. And really, it's going to be great workshops, great speakers. It's a 5-hour event that's just going to be killer. Lunches provided. It's going to be awesome. So get out there, get your tickets for that because they're going to go fast and it's going to be amazing. And I like to say, look, what's your plan for growth for 2024? I think events are a key component to that. We're doing one locally. We've made it cost effective. So if you're a man in the Central Florida, South Florida area, get your butt to that. And hey, if you want to fly in for that, come on down. And you should. It's going to be awesome. So with that, I want to bring up our guest today. She is the CEO and Chief Psychologist of Blessing Ranch Ministries. Their mission is to restore, renew, and equip Christian leaders for effective kingdom service. I had a great conversation with our guest. I said, let's get on the podcast. I want to talk about some things that I think are really important in regards to what they do. Super pumped to have Dr. Charity Byers. Please welcome her to the Man Up Already podcast. So much for being on the Man Up Already podcast.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Looking forward to conversation with you today.
Yeah, I was intrigued when we connected and heard about what you all do. So I really want to start there because what stuck out for me was, so often we hear about seeking out mentors and seeking out leaders and finding those people. But with the work that you do is actually help mentoring the leaders that are leading everybody else.
Right. Yes, absolutely. The ministry that I'm connected with is called Blessing Ranch, and it was founded by my mom and dad, John and Deanna Walker, back in the early 90s. And so, it's been almost 30 years now that we've been investing in Christian leaders. And, the point is, as you're kind of getting at here, that leaders spend so much time investing, pouring out, giving, and sacrificing. And somebody's got to hold their arms up once in a while, too. And so, we get the privilege of stepping in with really high capacity, often highly motivated, highly intelligent, very gifted people, and just helping equip them, encourage them, and help lead them forward so that they can show up in everything that they're being called to do.
And it started in Colorado. Do I have that right?
Yeah, Blessing Ranch got its name from an actual ranch property that we started on. It was north of the Fort Collins area, so beautiful part of Colorado. And, we had our ministry out there for about 20 years, and it was a beautiful place. Definitely would say a God-ordained property that just was full of God stories. But we did relocate the ministry to the Tampa area of Florida back in 2014. So, goodness, coming up on a decade ago, which is hard to believe. But we still do the very same thing we do. We just do it in a little bit different setting now down here in Florida, where we've traded the mountains for the beach. time. So you can't really go wrong. It's
No,
just,
you really can't.
you
Yeah.
find those people who said, man, I wish I would have come to see you when you were in Colorado, would have loved the mountains. And others are saying, the beach is my happy place. And I'm so thankful I get to go spend my afternoon sitting by the water and just having quiet time, there.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because obviously we live in Florida and have been here for a while, but when I need to recharge or when I need to get get in check spiritually and shut everything off, I go to a men's boot camp in Colorado. So
Is
I
that
need the mountains are that reset for me because, but on an everyday basis, the beauty of living in Florida, especially where we live now, the beaches or the water is 15 minutes away.
Yeah,
So it's a cool little check out. There's
yeah,
that healing aspect of it, um, for
that's
sure. So how old were you when your parents started the ministry? I mean, you grew up in this essentially.
Yeah, essentially, I was, the call came upon my dad's life to do this when I was probably somewhere around 10 years old.
Mm,
It took us a couple of years to disengage from our life. We were in Houston, Texas at the time. My dad was running a successful private practice as a psychologist. My mom was an attorney working for a corporation down there. And so they both had their lives. My sister and I had our lives going. And so anyway, it took us a couple of years to disengage from all of that and move to the ranch property in Colorado. So I was just about to turn 13, going into 8th grade when the move came. So tough time for a relocation, by the way, in a
yeah, I have
young
no
teenage
doubt.
life. But at the time, of course, couldn't appreciate fully all of the faith lessons that were going to become such a part of my story that were happening at the time. But as an adult now, can look back on those moments. It's just so formative in who I have become because of how I got to watch God at work.
And what was the because it was your dad and your mom or your dad that got the
My
call?
dad was the psychologist. My mom had her own career as an attorney for many years, supported the ministry, as much she could in that context. And then when she retired early from her career as an attorney, she did come on full time with the ministry. So it was kind of a both and. It was my dad, but it wouldn't be anything without my mom,
Oh, no, of course.
of
So
course.
where was what was the calling, right? Like what
Yes.
was hey, this is an issue that you need to do. Like what's the story there?
Yeah, my dad would say it was the one time in his life when he really feels like he just heard God speak.
Mm.
The loud and clear moment where there's just no denying that that is God's voice. Now, we hear God in all kinds of different ways, of course, in our daily life, but this was just one of those crystal clear, God is speaking, he needs my attention kind of moments. So I'll make the story relatively short, but the context was at the time of life, my grandfather, which was my dad's father, was very ill with terminal illness and couldn't leave home to go to church anymore. So the extended family gathered at his apartment on Sunday mornings to worship together. My dad was a pastor in the early years before he went back to school to become a psychologist. And so he would preach for the family at these, family church gatherings. Well, this one Sunday morning, he was kind of going over his preparation to speak that morning to the family. And that's when God just showed up. And I wish he were here to tell the story to you directly. But in essence, it was just a clear message that was, John, I don't need you to buy a family ranch. I need you to start a Christian leader resource and renewal center for Christian leaders.
That
And
clear.
that clear. I mean, that clear. It was a
Wow.
very clear directive. And of course, the beauty of that is that there was no denying it. And so, when times were hard, which they were, in the, founding anything is tough.
Yep.
Building, a ranch property from the ground up is tough. When all of that got really hard, what he always had to hold on to was the fact that God asked me to do this, and there is no way I can convince myself otherwise. So there was real beauty in that clarity that kept him going when times got hard.
Mm. And the work you do, that when we met, that was the compelling thing. So let's talk about why it's so important what you all do.
Hmm.
Um, because how many leaders are out there that are pouring into others, but then and obviously we'll pick up a conversation on bandwidth, but nobody talks about the lead, who's helping the leader.
Right. Yeah, I think certainly for many people out there, maybe who are members of a church or are part of an organization, we just don't stop and think about the impacts of what leaders carry. And I get the privilege of spending intimate time and hearing their stories, and the weight that's carried by leaders is so incredibly great. Because they care so deeply about what they're doing and who they're serving and what they're leading, and usually have such a high degree of responsibility that just the weight of what they carry is often huge. And people don't often realize that because they don't show it, maybe to their spouse or their intimate close group, but just the average person out there doesn't get to see it, because they show up and they serve, and that's the face that they put on. And so I think it's just the forgotten sometimes. People don't notice, they don't see what's behind the scenes in a leader's life. But beyond that, why what we do is so important is just the fact that we believe so deeply in God's church and the leaders, whether it's in a formal church setting or a kingdom leader out there. We just believe so deeply, in the place that plays in the big picture of what God's up to in this world, that we want to see that thrive. And so we need the leaders who are leading that to thrive. And they're usually going to be the last to ask for help. Once they're just busy taking care of others. Sometimes second, because they think because they're a leader, they should probably have this figured out by now and not be struggling the ways that they are. And three, because nobody notices sometimes. And so we just want to make sure there's resources, help, and investment into their hearts, into their lives, into their marriages, into their leadership in ways that keep them vital and thriving for the long haul.
I mean, obviously I have a deep personal connection to this topic because I've been in, or was in, a leadership role for almost 25 years, of between, running an entire high school music program to then getting into a business where I was mentoring, coaching, and leading, a flock essentially. And if you're taking somebody from being an employee and moving them into entrepreneurship, that's a journey, and you get into their lives and you're dealing with all kinds of stuff. But pounded into our brain was leaders never show hurt, never show doubt, right? Nobody can ever know if you're having a bad day, you can't show it. Nobody can know it. And if the outlets aren't there, like you're talking about, implosion does happen, and it can be really, really bad. In my personal experiences, it almost cost me everything because I imploded. And then in the last, almost 5 years now of unwinding all these things that we're just sitting there, never dealt with. I'm seeing the depth and how much deep respect I have for the work that you do. Because and we take it so for granted, right? Whether it's a pastor, or like you said, a leader in any capacity, we tend to take them for granted because we want our needs met, never ever thinking about the needs that the leader has.
That's right. And I think we just also make a lot of assumptions about them almost being invincible. I know, we talked a little bit about my dad founding this ministry, and I kind of grew up with that perception of him. He's just kind of invincible. Nothing probably gets to him. He doesn't ever seem to have a bad day. And of course, as an adult, I've come to realize that's not so true.
Right.
Now that we've had, more of an adult friendship. But certainly, I think just not only from that perspective of child to parent, but just, person to leader, we can often have that perception of sort of invincibility.
So I want to organize. I have a million thoughts running through my head, but I think the thing, because I know our listeners, right? So everybody is leading in some capacity. I mean, we have male and female listeners, and so we have fathers, and we have husbands, and we have moms and wives, and people in corporate America working jobs, and it's all leading in some capacity. I mean, I know for a fact, and I'll be transparent, and I'm sure she'll be very grateful that I said that, but how often did I take my wife for granted, right? That, what is she? Well, she's got this, or I've got to do this, and this is what I need, instead of what is she dealing with and processing? And, I've learned to be more sensitive and empathetic to that and to see that. And I think, she for me as well, but it shouldn't take implosion for those things to happen. So, I like to talk about, just what are ways that people listening can say, all right, I need to get present to one, what are my expectations of the people that are in my life that are in that role, or from a partnership standpoint. I think you know where I'm going. Like, what are things that we can do to recognize it and help and just be more sensitive to it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think very practically, and one of the best things that you kind of talked about in your own story is just to start to ask questions and to, set aside our assumptions of what we think we know to be true. So, for
Mm.
example, you talked about take my wife for granted. Well, she can handle it, or, this is just what we need to do. So we need to set aside our assumptions and we need to start to ask questions. And so if we just come with that attitude, we've now invited a little bit more transparency, a little bit more authenticity, hopefully, into that relationship. I think that's a great start to, be able to open the doors to much more.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just talking to somebody about it. The difference between expectations and observations.
Mm,
I had actually heard it. It was a marriage therapist's article, and one of the contributors to marriages failing was that people spend more time in expectation than in observation. And I thought that was a
oh,
really powerful distinction.
yeah. Yeah. We could have an hour-long conversation about expectations, I imagine.
Well, let's have a 5-minute conversation. I'd love to know your thoughts because we do it with you're mentoring pastor, leaders, but how much do we expect from our leaders and not right? We're so into expectation, we're not observing. Like
Mhm.
my wife and I were a part of a church that was a startup, and it was a wonderful thing to be a part of. And and right around the corner was a mega church.
Mm.
And the mega church lost sight of the relationship aspect because they got so big. And I'm a firm believer that don't sacrifice relationships for growth. And I watched a big church do that. And so
Mhm.
in the small church, I was like, gosh, I hope they don't fall into that trap. And
Yeah.
they did. They started chasing growth. And
Yeah.
the pastor he had no bandwidth, and he
Yeah.
fell apart, and his collapse took the whole church
Yeah. Wow.
with it. And we watched that happen.
Yeah.
And and so everybody has an expectation of what should happen and what he should do instead of observing what is really going on here and how do we step in to keep that from happening. And nobody had that, and it fell apart.
Mhm. Well, some of my thoughts around expectations, I mean, the first is just that they exist on all levels, right? When we just take a church as an example, there's expectations that, those who attend the church have of its leadership. There's expectations that everybody has for the outcomes of the church itself. And then there's expectations that perhaps the leaders have of themselves within it. And I think all of those can end up being detrimental if we don't manage them well. And I think the second, piece that's so important in this conversation around expectations is to begin to examine where it is they come from.
Mm,
Because we just, we all come into things with our life history that has shaped our expectations. And so, when you talk about church growth, that's often an expectation that people come in with, right? If we're starting a church, it should grow. Well, I'm not saying one way or another we should or shouldn't abide by that, but it's just an expectation that exists. Or a leader, for example, they might have the expectation that I'm supposed to be able to handle anything that comes and not fall apart. Whatever it is we tell ourselves, we've got these expectations that can be good things gone wrong really quickly. And again, the question is, where do these things come from? Because often we operate without examining them. Like, when you talk about expectations versus observations, we're not stepping back from our expectations often enough to say, first, where does this come from? And is it something that aligns with God's expectations to make it healthy?
Hmm.
So, if you want to, we can talk about where they come from, but I just think that's such an important question because it leads us to that place of open-handedness with them that's allowing us to now examine whether they're
Well,
loving.
I would love to talk about where they come from because we're all, like you said, we're a product of upbringing, of programming, of
Right?
things that we believe are true that might not necessarily, be true, or this is what a marriage is supposed to look like, or this is what a church is supposed to look like. And all of that comes from somewhere.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we all just operate with our normal, right? We have a normal that we're used to and we go on autopilot with it. But how has it been created? Like you're talking about here, what we call these things around here at Blessing Ranch are heart shapers. They're the parts of our stories that have had impact and input on the core of us, our hearts. Now, this is where expectations come from, and we can unpack
Mm.
that whole thing another time. But the root of expectations lives down here in our hearts. It's not just something we picked up, in a book we read. It's something that flows out of something that's deeply rooted within us. And so, our heart shapers can be all kinds of things that we've encountered throughout life. Some of them can be, a very obvious one would be our family of origin. The things that we've learned from our closest caregivers, our greatest influences. What have they taught us about who we should be, what a leader looks like, what health looks like in life. Other things can be kind of our defining moments of life. A moment, it could be either good or bad, negative or positive, but those sort of just defining moments. It could be mountaintops or valleys that just teach you something in an instant. It can be just also our everyday experiences, kind of the cumulative effect of living something day after day after day, just feeling like you're the different one. You look around and you see everybody else seems the same, and then there's me. That's just
Mm.
something you live day after day after day. But through all of that, it's defining some very important things according to your heart shapers and what themes were within them. It teaches your heart something very critical. And I think the point of all that is it's from that place with which we begin to form expectations. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Very much so. It's I'm brought to mind. It's a comical story, at least from our experience, but it kind of proves. I call it level of awareness, right? Like, so New Year's just happened not that long ago, and so we're in our house and we're in a relatively new community, and all of a sudden, right, bombs go off. I mean, like bombs, and I can tell from how close the bomb is that my neighbor is lighting off fireworks, right? But it wasn't, like a Roman candle or a sparkler or a firecracker. Whatever he lit off was loud, shook the house, etc. Right?
Wow.
So the next day, there's all the debris of his fireworks in our yard, and so
Oh,
my
that's like,
so we're cleaning it up or whatever. But my wife ran into the neighbor, and he said, some people like were knocking on his door or whatever, and he was shocked that there was a problem, and his response was, "It's New Year's Eve. What am I supposed to do?"
right.
Right? And so it was just funny because it was like you have no awareness of like, no, that's not appropriate. Like you're disrupting the neighborhood. Not everybody's going to be on board with that.
Yeah.
You could have at least come and said, "Hey,
Right.
I've got some things I'm going to light," but it was just, well, it's New Year's Eve. What am I supposed to do? Like,
Yeah. That's
you know
so
what I mean? That was that level of expectation of everybody around him.
right. Right. So somewhere he's had a heart shaper in his story that taught him that's okay. Right.
Right,
Taught
right.
him not to consider the impacts on other people when you do things.
That's got to be a really like unwinding that for people, right? Because some of those things are really deep rooted, right? Like they could be a complete paradigm reality shift for a lot of people on, what do you mean that's not normal?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. The first step of that is self-awareness, of course, to bring attention to what it is that exists within you. And I think, that idea of living by our normal just means we often don't even realize we're operating with expectations. It's just the way we do life, right? It doesn't register as this is something unique to me or this is something I've defined as a way of life. It's just life. So I
Mm.
think that's the first part, is just being able to call attention to what is within us. But you're right to say there's a lot to unwind, because for a lot of people, these are tied oftentimes to things that not only have a lot of history, as in happened a long time ago and I've lived this way for a long time, which does, create deep ruts within us, but sometimes they're really tied to things that were connected to pain, even trauma at times for people. And so what that means oftentimes is these expectations, they feel adaptive, they feel helpful, they feel safe to people, and that's a whole nother level of trying to unwind it inside of people. If you've got that layer on top of this somehow has been determined as safe, helpful, protective, in life, realigning somebody with a new way is a complicated matter that, of course, requires God's healing touch and, a process of healing within that.
Yeah, big time. I know that very well. Um, it has led me to believe, and I love your take on this, that true healing from those things only really comes, one, right, through God, but two, there's got to be a desire for them to change. Otherwise, we're going to hold on to them.
Mhm.
I mean, I've had the unfortunate experience of watching people die in those expectations,
Yeah. Yeah.
because there was just an unwillingness to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that is often true. Um, and so, it makes me think about, the story when Jesus looks at the man and says, "Do you want to get well?"
Mm.
Asks that very strategic question: "Do you want to get well?" And it seems like a silly question. Why do you need to bother to ask that? Of course he does, but the point is, you got to want to,
Does he
right?
really, really want, right? I never ever looked at that in that context, but thank you for
Sure.
revealing. I mean, that really is true. Like, why would he ask that? Because he really wants to know,
Yeah.
do
Do you?
you really want to get well? Because we could be, and to your point, we could be in dysfunction and we can be in pain and we can be in all these things, but they become comfortable. It's what we know,
Yeah. Even
you know?
dysfunctional things, right, can be really comfortable. And, healing requires surrender. It requires us to lay something down.
Mm,
And, that's not an easy process, again, especially when, let's say, just due to past trauma or something like that, it feels like the safest thing to hold on to that and have that, even though someone else in your life would say that's dysfunctional, that's not serving you well, that's not healthy. But to you, because of those heart shapers in your story, it feels like I can't let go of this, or I'm too afraid of what could be on the other side of the unknown. So it really takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of surrender to actually engage in a healing process with God.
the I'm so glad you said that. Dr. Dave White is my coach. He's been my coach for, gosh, I think it might be 4 years. But Dave said something to me when he came into my life that radically shifted me. Was he said, "You're so used to manic,
Mm.
you think it's normal."
Yeah.
And the man I am today, and this is why I want to segue into bandwidth. I have so much more bandwidth
Mm.
on what I can deal with and take on
Mhm.
because I was able to unwind all the things that made me manic.
Mhm.
But I had to want to, to want to really deal with it. And once I really saw what that looked like,
Yeah.
um, it astounded me. And I think now, even today, when I look upon that, like I literally go, now, who lives like that? But the answer was I did, right? Like, like it's just
And
absurd when
people.
you're healed from it or when you see it. But while you're in it,
Yeah.
you just think it's normal. And for me, it was normal for 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've lived a little bit of that myself. I don't know that anyone's ever called me manic, thank goodness. But, I kind of grew up with, the expectation that, just doing whatever has got to be done is what you're supposed to do. And I think some of that comes as we talk about heart shapers, me watching my mom and dad start Blessing Ranch, and that took a lot of sacrifice. For my dad tells stories like, the first 3 years building the ministry, he didn't have a day off, not for 3 years, because not only was it the work as a psychologist, but then on the weekends he was doing construction and
Mm.
building and fundraising and all the other things that comes with that. And that's just a snippet of what it took to live out the calling that was on their life. All that to say, my expectation developed into this idea that you're just supposed to do whatever it takes, no matter what it costs you. And so I think that's probably something a lot of people, a lot of leaders can relate to when they care deeply about something or they feel called to something. You kind of live with this idea of whatever it takes. And that's just one reason why maybe some of us live a little bit closer to manic than we ought to.
Well, back up, because if we put that out of the context of leadership, and like I shared with you, everybody's in some leadership or role at some point. How many husbands, wives, mothers, fathers are doing, well, whatever it takes? And women certainly in parenting, right, have that, I'll do whatever it takes, at the point of they lose themselves in that role.
Right.
Right. And that's what I mean by bandwidth, right? Like next thing you know, you're just, the relationships surrounding that get destroyed, because while you're doing whatever it takes, you haven't replenished yourself and the other things
of your marriage or relationships. And so it's important, I think, to be clear here that God does call us to sacrifice, right? And so, we're not trying to paint a picture here of self first. There's absolutely room for sacrifice in that paradigm. But I think what I just hear you saying is, but we can't dishonor the other parts of what God has called us to, right? To be a husband or a father or, mother or friend, or to honor the souls within us. Those are all parts, I would say, of the calling that God has put on our life, not just to be a business leader, ministry leader, church leader.
Yeah. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this. The oxygen mask in the airplane comes down and they tell you to put it on you first,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that you can be, you have the capacity to take care of everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that's often, I remember when I first heard that, I was like, what do you mean? I'm going to put it on my,
Of course.
somebody else. And that was, no, if you're dead, you can't help anybody, And so I think the work that you do is helping people learn how to heal inside so that they have more capacity to help others.
That's right. And I think the other, layer of that too is just to look at, if we're living in a perpetually unhealthy state, the impact and influence we end up having on others is also unhealthy. And so, it's not always just, sometimes we just burn out. We got no energy to help anybody, but sometimes we're just showing up so unhealthy that we're unhealthily influencing everything around us. Like you hear stories of like a leadership team where, the top level leader is burned out or irritable all the time or just has lost passion, and everybody else is sort of suffering alongside because that influence just bleeds into the whole environment that you're now leading. So it's pretty detrimental when we don't put on our oxygen mask first.
So let's dive in a little bit to what I call bandwidth, which is the capacity to handle the things that we need to handle in life and do them with grace and with empathy and with care and compassion. I think out of my journey, I have stepped into this insatiable need and desire to make sure I am showing up with grace, with empathy, with care, compassion. It's no longer, I'm not manic anymore, right? So I'm not in crisis. So I have more bandwidth to deal with the needs of others, et cetera. So I'd love to kind of dive into that a little bit on ways that you see from your experience, your incredible experience, that people can start to apply in their own lives to get more capacity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one of the big principles is to be able to recognize and honor the fact that we all have limits. And some of that ties back to our conversation around expectations. But I just come up against a lot of people who just don't want to own the fact that they have limits. And, if that's kind of the expectation we live by is, either I should be able to do whatever it takes and it doesn't matter what it costs me, or, I should be able to be the Energizer Bunny who never runs out, whatever that is. We don't give ourselves the grace of accepting limits oftentimes. And so we then conclude we're a failure, we're a weak leader, something like that, instead of just saying, actually, it's a beautiful gift from God to have limits. And here's why. Because when we embrace our limits, we become more dependent upon God, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
It's there in which we realize I'm not supposed to be the savior of the world. I'm not supposed to have all the answers. I don't have to be in control. Actually, I get to operate in partnership with you, God. And so it's a beautiful gift to have limits. We just often don't see it that way. So I think that's the first piece for people practically, just to make sure that you are in a place that you actually appreciate the fact that you have limits and see it as a gift that allows you to operate in dependency with God.
That's so good. That's so good. I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking, in my own experience of, just in myself and then watching others, what came to mind is we're coming off the holidays and how often, I'm going to do it all, right? I'm going to cook the perfect meal. Or Clark Griswold, right, comes to mind. You know what I mean? But how often is the holiday event missed
Yeah.
because we're so preoccupied with doing it all and getting it all done that we show up exhausted, or we've just missed a moment where
Yeah.
maybe if we realize, you know what, let's simplify so
Yes.
that we can enjoy the moment more
Mm.
rather than going to capacity and being gassed and unpresent during the whole event.
Absolutely. And part of this, I think, is too just about asking ourselves the question as we examine our capacity or our bandwidth. After we've recognized that we have limits, it's about understanding what it is that God has asked us to do and what we've asked ourselves to do.
Ooh.
To our, example here of the holidays, right? Who asked you to cook the 5-course meal? Who asked you to, have whatever professional looking gift wrap on all of your packages? Whatever the example is, who asked you to do that? Well, it wasn't God. He asked you to show up and love others today.
Oh, that's so awesome.
And so, I think we need to really take a hard look at, who's writing those expectations in our life, so that when we realign those with God, right, I think it gets much, much closer to your picture of simplicity. And it is, I believe, of course, God's picture of expectations leaves us in that place of bandwidth. And so if we can get very honest with ourselves and say, all these things I've written for myself, or culture has written for myself, or my family of origin wrote for me, or these are just expectations people have of me that I don't need to abide by, and we're able to set those aside, what's left there, I think, is a very manageable, doable, healthy set of expectations that come from God. And they're pretty simple. Love others, love me with all your heart. I'll just leave it there and just say they're pretty simple.
They are. And it which is very present too in our humanity, how often we make complicated something so
Mhm.
simple. Like we spend so much time um in our flesh, right? In our
Right.
what do we look like? What do we sound like? What's the presentation? How are we showing up perceived? And a lot of it has to do with perception of others instead of what you're talking about. Like, what is God asking me to do? Which is really simple. How do I fill this place with love? And how do I do it in a way that allows me to do it? How do I do it in a way that allows me to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
That's so good. Anything else on that topic that you think people should kind of pay attention to?
Well, I mean, I do just think it's very important to recognize that most of us are living beyond our bandwidth in our day-to-day life. At least we're pushing the bounds. I think that's true for most people. And, the best of us just isn't going to show up when we're either pushed to that limit of our bandwidth or we're living beyond it, which I think many, many people are. And so, we're not going to show up as our best selves in that place. And I think, again, if we come back to the simple ideas of what God asks of us and we just zero in on this one principle, love, the Lord your God with all your heart and love others as you've loved yourself, in order to do that, in order to love, like that takes a lot of bandwidth, doesn't it?
Mm.
In order to show up, to put others first, to think about their needs or their desires beyond our own, to be present truly, it takes a lot of bandwidth to do those things. And so, I think it's just worthy to really examine why we're doing what we're doing, And to connect this back to our earlier conversation, so much of why we're doing what we're doing is motivated by some unhealthy heart shaper in your life and not God himself. And so if we can own that, recognize it, and heal from that, we've created freedom within to just redefine what's expected of us, and hopefully rein that into a place where that is defined by God, and in that place it's manageable and it's reasonable, and that is where we will see things like fruit of the Spirit come out of us.
Yeah, it's so good. It just I'm thinking of how, and I'm guilty of it. You know, the great thing is I've matured enough where I can recognize when I'm doing it. Um, because the warning sign, like I'm able to recognize the warning signs when I'm doing it. And I literally wrote, like, I am my own source of stress,
Mm, right.
right? You know what I mean? Like when my wife will be like, why are you doing that? And it is a great question, right? Because then you go, okay, hold on. Why am I doing that? And
Right.
the answer is, oh, because I expect this or this or this. And then we'll, like you said, well, where is that coming from and
Right.
why?
Right.
I'll give a great example of that. The other day on Tuesday, I had somebody book an appointment for my financial business, and they booked it in the evening, and they booked it in my office.
Mhm.
And prior to us having our own firm, I was in a corporate culture where evening appointments were expected,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It was the norm.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until getting out where people would ask, "Do you do evening appointments?" Like it was some special thing. And I'd be like, "Yeah, of course." Like, and
Right.
then over time, I realized how much of that was robbing my bandwidth because I'm working all day and then I'm working in the evening and I wasn't able to recover right at night, wind down, et cetera, et cetera. And I've learned how important evening routine is. And so because I didn't make it clear on my scheduling app,
Yep.
right? Next thing you know, I'm working till 8 o'clock at night. I didn't eat well. I didn't sleep well. Irritable the next day. It's like a cascade of events that happened. Instead of just going, I'm not doing evening appointments unless there's a special circumstance, and I can control
Right.
that source. But
Yes.
when it was, well, why are you doing that? And the answer is, well, because we've always done it that way. That doesn't necessarily mean it's
Absolutely.
right and healthy, you know?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And I love to just reflect on the way that Jesus lived his life to answer that question around, well, what should our rhythm look like? What's healthy and what's not? Should we be working around the clock, or is it okay to take breaks or a vacation? And if you really do examine the way he lived his life, you see, very intentional rhythm of obviously investing deeply and loving others well and showing up, but you also see the getting alone and getting quiet and refilling moments that, I always just have this picture in my head of like the crowd waiting for him, and yet he's up on the mountain in prayer.
Right.
And it's such a picture to me of priority. And so I always just come back to that every time I start to question myself, like, could you do more? Should you do more? Oh, wait, does this look like the way that he modeled it for us or not?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's I'm just very present in our ego sinful nature, how we and when I use the word sin, I just to be physical and to be human is just we're screwing up left
Yeah.
and right, right? Like when we go, okay, well, even God took time to rest and get quiet and do all those things, the most perfect human being ever, right? Which God manifested and he did it, and yet we don't need that. We'll just disregard that, and we'll just take control and do it our way anyway.
True. That's right.
It is quite absurd when you look at it from the outside, right? But
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
we don't see that while we're doing it. Well, this has been, I could go another hour with you. It's just, I think the things that we're talking about, but more importantly, the work that you do is
Okay.
just crucial. And I'm so grateful that we were able to connect and have you here and just to talk a little bit of it. I always like to ask our guests how people can find you, connect with you, take advantage of what you're doing, et cetera.
Yeah, our website is blessingranch.org. So you can connect with everything we have to offer there through our website with intensive counseling and coaching and team experiences and resources. And we're also on Facebook and Instagram if you want to find us there.
Is that right?
That's right.
Perfect. Well, it has been a pleasure. I encourage people to look up all the resources that you all have, connect with you. We met on, we met through a mutual connection, but we are connected on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's a great place to just connect with people and see what they're up to and how they're touching lives. So it's been an honor.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation and appreciate the time with you today.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Man Up Already podcast. We really do appreciate it. And I want to ask you to do a couple of things. Number one, subscribe to the podcast, whatever platform you're listening or viewing on, subscribe to the podcast, right? Help us, right, continue to grow by joining the community, and also rate the podcast, rate the episode, right? Whatever platform you're on, you could leave a rating. Let us know your comments. Let us know your thoughts. If you can do that, we really do want your feedback. You could head on over to manupalready.com and check out our website. All the podcast episodes are on there as well. But also join our community, sign up on our emailing list. We're going to get content out to you. There's also a free resource there for you when you do that. And pass it on. Pass on the podcast. Let people know, right, what we're up to, what we're about. Speak about it. If you're a podcast enthusiast, please share episodes. Tell people about what it is that we do. What we do here and what you like about it, and what you don't like about it, and that's okay as well. Right? It's just getting the word out. And then finally, I want to thank a great sponsor of our podcast, Master Beef Jerky. Their slogan is bold flavor, tender bite. If you head on over to masterbeefjerky.com, they've got incredible flavors there. But if you put in the coupon code MUAP, you will get 20% off your order. I highly recommend you check them out. Master Beef Jerky, bold flavor, tender bite, and a great sponsor of the podcast. Until next time, thanks so much for being here, and we'll talk to you soon.